I'm John Evans, president of the Metropolitan Cable Club. I want to welcome you and our C-SPAN viewers to the January meeting. Our speaker today is Dennis Leibowitz, who is Senior Vice President Analyst for Donaldson, Lufkin & Jenrette. In this capacity as an analyst, he covers broadcasting, cable television, cellular radio, and the lodging industries. Dennis came to his current position from a distinguished career as a vice president of E.F. Hutton and a partner at Coleman & Company. He was also a senior analyst at Bache & Company and a junior partner at Merrill Lynch. Dennis is a member of the New York Society of Security Analysts, has served on the board of directors of the International Radio and Television Society, and is an author of the lodging section of the Financial Analyst's Handbook. He attended the Wharton School of Finance and received his Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Pennsylvania. It's with great pleasure that I present to you as our January speaker, my friend and colleague, Dennis Leibowitz.
Thank you, John. The victory streak that the cable television industry has compiled in the regulatory area in the last several years may be on the verge of being broken. The lifting of almost all restraints, most recently of pricing and signal carriage requirements, and some power displays by the more aggressive cable operators, have created a backlash psychology in the regulators' camp, which has been egged on by Hollywood broadcasters and telephone companies who claim that the industry is an unregulated monopoly. The FCC is reevaluating its cable rules, and Congress is about to review the Cable Act of 1984 to see what, if any, changes are advisable. The administration's communications policy arm is conducting a study of the whole policy spectrum, and Judge Harold Green is involved in the debate over whether the ban on telephone companies providing such information services as cable does should be lifted. The numerous issues to be reviewed by the regulators include subscriber ownership limits, the compulsory copyright payment system, distant signal exclusivity, distribution of programming to backyard earth station owners, must-carry rules, and channel repositioning. In our view, the most important is the role of the telephone company. Telephone companies are prohibited from owning cable systems in areas in which they offer phone service. Independent telephone companies can own cable systems outside of their phone service areas, and Centel is a prime example of one who does. The regional Bell operating companies, however, can't own cable anywhere because of a different problem. The modified final judgment in the breakup of AT&T, which is supervised by Judge Green, prohibits them from providing information services, and cable is considered to fit that description. In addition to these specific rules, vertical integration is a broader policy issue that is more a matter of political philosophy than a specific item relative to the cable business. Vertical integration has escalated in the cable industry as it has in general corporate America and in other media and entertainment fields. Movie companies have been accumulating theaters, for instance, which was found to be illegal 40 years ago. The proportions this issue assumes may be determined by the upcoming elections. The only certainty is that the benefactor of the present antitrust climate, Ronald Reagan, won't be in charge after this year. For cable, the present situation, which verges on a political and economic checkmate, is almost ideal. In most localities, cable is a de facto monopoly whose potential competitors are hobbled either by regulation or economics. In the regulatory arena, two of the logical adversaries, the telephone companies and the television networks, are legally prohibited from entering the business. On the economic scene, high upfront costs and the need for high penetration make the math prohibitive for a second and presumably a later operator, other things being equal. Other things, of course, are not always equal, and not only because of the timing differences. Through vertical integration, operators have increasingly gained control of the programs for which the consumer buys the service. This strategy enhances their positions for several reasons. First, they can assure exclusivity of the best product. Second, they can participate in the profits of the program networks. And third, because there's often room for only one service in a particular specialty, they can use their access to the consumer to make it difficult for a new competitor to gain a foothold, or they can demand equity in a program venture in exchange for carriage. Cable operators enjoy an additional advantage over the broadcast networks. They have two sources of income, advertising and circulation fees, like magazines, which enables them to provide the same programming with fewer advertising dollars. Differences in union requirements extend this advantage, as evidenced by CNN's profitable round-the-clock news service, which operates on half of the budget of any of the three commercial networks. To top it off, no one governs cable pricing or return on investment. None of this is necessarily bad or unique. Studios own theaters, networks own stations. NBC has exclusivity on The Bill Cosby Show, although unlike cable operators, it can't participate in the syndication market, the show's biggest potential profit generator. Also, I question whether the situation would be better if the phone company controlled all entertainment and communications coming into the home, rather than the current situation in which there's only one cable company, but one that does not control the more necessary voice channels. However, the present cable condition is also probably too good to continue as is. Consequently, we would expect that the industry will lose a couple. Indeed, it might be well advised to try to throw a round or two to prevent more serious damage. In fact, with Must Carry, it tried, but the industry can't even seem to lose one on purpose. The seeds of trouble lie in the source of the cable's recent success, the cable industry's recent success, deregulation, and specifically the Cable Act of 1984. Court decisions have indicated that exclusive licenses are a thing of the past. Consequently, the question becomes whether competition makes economic sense. According to the conventional wisdom, if it takes at least 40% penetration to make a reasonable return on investment, and cable penetration is not likely to exceed somewhere between 60 and 70%, a second competitor cannot succeed if the first operator already has 40 to 50%, assuming similar pricing for similar services. If the first operator has exclusivity on some product, the odds are stacked even further against the newcomer. At the Western Cable Show in December, Samuel Book of Malarkey Taylor Research concluded that in 2 of 3 overbuild scenarios that he studied, the second competitor would lose money. In the third, he would achieve margins of only 8 to 10%. Where cable operators have provided poor service or high prices, however, the opportunities for competition are better, presuming that the cities can't issue exclusive franchises. This is especially true if the second service providers can cherry-pick the best areas, or if they can enter new areas without having to meet all the requirements imposed on the initial operator. That's an issue that the courts still haven't resolved. Although it's more, at the moment, a nuisance than a general industry threat, overbuilding is becoming more common because there are isolated instances where conditions are ripe, and because the industry's increasing prosperity increases the incentive. Florida Power and Light is the best-known overbuilder, and it claims to be making money. Irving Kahn's Broadband Communications will attempt to go head-to-head against the New York Times' 54-channel Cherry Hill, New Jersey system with a partial fiber optic plant that Mr. Kahn claims he can build at a price competitive with coaxial cable. Where overbuilding has occurred, there have often been sharp rate reductions by the original operator that the newcomer has to meet, which destroys the profitability of both. Such guerrilla warfare is unlikely to escalate, in my opinion, but we could envision one scenario that could materially threaten the cable industry. If the telephone companies are allowed to build the cable systems. Because they're gradually replacing their copper telephone wire with optical fibers, the telephone companies would have the capacity for the first time to provide competition to cable on the same wire that provides telephone service. Telephone wires don't have the bandwidth to provide even one conventional television channel, but fiber optics could provide 100, as well as telephone, data, two-way impulse shopping, and pay-per-view to boot. Such added capacity might also make them a better choice to provide spectrum-hungry, high-definition video. Theoretically, if they were building fiber into the home anyway for telephone service, they could provide cable services at relatively little incremental cost. There would be significant efficiencies in using their installers and service people, operators, and back office help who were already in place to duplicate the same functions for cable subscribers. The phone companies also enjoy low capital costs. The RBOCs have very long-term views of things, and it's this perspective as well as the low incremental costs that would encourage them to provide cable service, which they could do at a relatively low price. Even if they were prohibited from controlling the information flow, they could lease capacity to a cable operator at a cost much lower than pertains for an inferior, or what would then be an inferior coaxial cable plant today. While the lessee of fiber from the phone company could be the existing cable operator, he would have to abandon his existing plant. It could just as easily, however, be a competing operator, if not the telephone company itself, or both the existing operator and a competitor. While the Commission rules prohibit a telephone company from cross-subsidizing, that is, providing cable service in this case, below cost by using the profits from local toll calls, what if the economies of using the same fiber to the phone company actually permit leasing some of the capacity for entertainment channels at much lower costs than pertain today? That could benefit the current operator, but what would he do with his existing plant? Even if the current operator benefits, the probability of competition rises because the entry barriers would be lessened to the potential competitors. Instead of being obligated to make enormous upfront capital commitments that are now required to build a cable plant, the second operator would merely lease time from the telephone company with no upfront investment. That's not the worst of it. If one fiber in the home can provide such integrated services as entertainment, voice, and data transmission, what is the function of the cable operator? Why can't a programmer sell directly to the consumer instead of paying the majority of his receipts to the cable operator? Why shouldn't it spawn packagers like those already selling programs to backyard earth station owners? When HBO or Showtime sells its services directly to such a customer, it takes, either one of them takes 2 or 3 times the profit out of it that they earn with the same customer being a pay cable subscriber. Some people theorize that entry by the phone companies could be a blessing because they'd simply buy the existing cable operators, much as they've bought the non-wireline cellular radio operators. But why would they do that? The RBOCs would have no use for the existing coaxial cable plant if they were building fiber for telephone and data service anyway. In cellular, they have to buy in order to get the license. In cable, they don't. The logical answer is that they would be buying the customer base. But is it necessary to pay $2,200 a subscriber for that if it only cost $800 a subscriber to build a new coaxial plant, and theoretically ultimately less for that portion of an integrated fiber network that would be used to distribute the entertainment programming? The answer may depend ultimately on timing. Specifically, how long will it be before the telephone company would be able economically to justify running fiber into the home? Fiber is already being used for intercity telephone traffic and between central telephone switching offices, but it isn't economical yet for that last mile to the home. On a freestanding basis, fiber probably would not make sense, even for new construction, for another 3 or 4 years. The economics and therefore the timing would change radically, however, if they are allowed to provide or transport cable service, because that would generate an enormous additional income stream. The promise of accelerated development of fiber by using the economic advantages of an integrated communications entertainment system to reduce local phone rates might entice some regulators to lift the cross-ownership ban. The average cable system will generate about $25 a month in 1988, compared to about $15 a month for local telephone service. If 60% of the subscribers take the entertainment portion, cable could theoretically double the local telephone company's revenues. The timing is important because the longer it takes to justify fiber, the more depreciated the cable operator's existing plant will be, and the more use there will be of fiber by the cable operators themselves. Fiber makes sense for the cable MSOs because of channel capacity constraints, especially with high definition coming, if the economics are in line. ATC is working on what it calls a fiber backbone concept that is designed to overlay existing cable systems to increase capacity, enhance signal quality, and improve the economics of distribution. The current timetable for the phone companies to rewire America with fiber is far enough away so that cable may be there just as soon, assuming the rules remain what they are today. The big question then becomes whether the rules will change. Several developments are brewing concurrently in the regulatory area. The FCC is conducting an inquiry on whether to allow the phone companies to offer cable services. Prohibitions against such cross-ownership have been in place since 1970, and they were codified in the Cable Act of 1984. The Commission received comments from telephone, cable, and other interests in November and December, and replies are due this month. Because the cross-ownership restrictions are part of the Cable Act, however, the FCC can't officially lift them. It will, however, make a recommendation to the Congress, and it sounds from the comments I read of the chairman that the recommendation will be to lift the ban. Meanwhile, in the Congress, the House Telecommunications Subcommittee plans oversight hearings in February on the Cable Act, its first review of how it's working out since it was adopted 3.5 years ago. Separately, Representative Howard Nielsen intends to introduce a bill to eliminate the statutory ban. Whatever Congress does, there's another obstacle. As I mentioned before, Judge Green concluded his triennial reassessment of the modified final judgment last fall and concluded that he would still reiterate the ban on information services. Stirring the pot further, though, the administration's policy arm, the NTIA, opposes Judge Green's continuing authority over telephone matters, and it's urged the FCC to issue a declaratory ruling that it is in the public interest for the RBOX to provide information services, thereby challenging the judge's authority. If the FCC were to do this, the confrontation would ultimately have to be settled in the courts. Meanwhile, NTIA announced plans for a wide-ranging study of cable television service in November to determine what policy changes are needed to assure a competitive environment. The study, which will be concluded this spring, will examine the franchise process, the cost of cable and fiber optic plant, concentration of ownership, and program distribution. It is to be part of a massive study to be called Telecom 2000 that the agency hopes will lay the groundwork for communications policy in the next century, much as the last study, the Rostow report, that was done 20 years ago, did for the latter half of the 20th century. In a related development, the FCC will decide shortly whether to permit as an experiment a fiber optic integrated cable system that GTE wants to build to serve the 16,000 homes in Cerritos, California. GTE is the local telephone company there, which is near Los Angeles, and it's offered to construct a 550 megahertz cable system in which 40 channels will be leased to the local cable franchisee, Apollo Cable. GTE would retain an equal capacity for experimentation in providing home banking, home shopping, and video on demand services that would allow consumers to choose from a library of hundreds of movie titles. According to the January 4th issue of Broadcasting, the company wants to test consumer response to these services and to conduct side-by-side tests of fiber, coaxial cable, and twisted pair telephone wires for the transportation of voice, data, and video. GTE says it would consider entering all areas of the cable business if the restrictions were lifted, although it's more interested in the transport than the programming functions. The FCC enters the picture because a temporary waiver of existing cross-ownership rules is required. The cable industry opposes GTE's request also for another reason, because it raises the specter of a return to the days of excessive municipal demands on franchisees. While the cities can't control the rates anymore, the issue of the requirements of what they can impose are still unfolding in the courts, as I mentioned before. Where will all this lead? I don't know, but I think the glare of publicity will heat up. The good news is I think it's unlikely that the industry will lose on the really important issues of telephone cross-ownership and vertical integration. Cable may have to duck a few rotten tomatoes thrown by its adversaries while it occupies the Washington stage. If it gives a good performance, however, the current hit show will continue to play without cuts. The worst will likely not come to pass for political reasons, I think. The powers that count on the congressional communication subcommittees are more suspicious of the telephone companies than they are of the cable operators. This is not a clear-cut partisan issue, but the Democrats are probably less likely to favor lifting the cross-ownership ban than the Republicans, and they constitute the majority in the only government branch that has the power to change the law. Neither of the likely chief proponents of letting the phone companies provide cable services, the FCC or NTIA, has the power to do it. In fact, considering current congressional sentiment, an FCC proposal to let the phone companies in might just be the ticket to keeping them out. A change in the political parties at the White House would also thus pose less of a threat on this issue than on most business matters. In that case, the vertical integration question, however, would loom larger, but I'll worry about that later. Cable stocks have recovered from most of the damage that was done in late October, and the cash flow trends and transaction prices since that time indicate that so far nothing bad has happened. If this sentiment continues to encourage investors to bid up the shares to their old highs right now, I'd be a little worried. Whether or not anything comes of the approaching hearings, the publicity won't be good because there's nothing to gain and there's a lot to lose. If, on the other hand, the publicity cripples the stocks, I'd be much more enthusiastic about the group than I am now. We currently have a relatively limited list of cable stock buy recommendations, and the lack of names doesn't reflect a lack of enthusiasm about industry prospects, which I consider exciting and probably among the least cyclical of any areas I follow, but rather my reservations about a combination of what are historically high valuations in the private market at a time when the regulatory debates are about to surface. As things stand now, in my opinion, cable is one of the most attractive industries around. It's not cyclical. It's likely to continue growing faster than the economy. It's increasingly producing excess cash flow. And most importantly, it's becoming embedded in the popular culture. If all goes well, cable can eventually assume the dominant role in transmitting entertainment in the country that has been held traditionally by the television networks. With these prospects, in an uncertain economic and stock market climate, if the stocks really did get hit by fears of regulation, and I'm right about the ultimate outcome, it could produce a real home run. Thank you.
Well, you've certainly created an interesting scenario as to sort of the worst case scenario, I suppose. Now, having said all that, bottom line, your bottom line on the industry is?
My bottom line is that the industry is very attractive, that probably as much as any communications industry right now, that the really exciting potential is that it sort of feeds on itself, the sort of cultural phenomena I was talking about, and becomes the dominant entertainment force, in which case, at the same time the construction slowed down, the industry will be enormously profitable, and if it feeds on itself, we'll have the kind of penetrations that you see in Canada. Now, they take it for different reasons, but I've always used Canada as a model because it shows you at least what the economic limits are, and their penetration of homes passed is over 85%.
Okay. Some of the new services coming along the pike, like pay-per-view. Do you have any thoughts on pay-per-view, home shopping, new service offered by New Media, which is a classified service for cable? Those are three of the up-and-coming.
I think that a lot of that gets back to the same issues, not so much whether they're going to work, but who's going to own them. And that, again, gets to this whole issue of the telephone companies. You might have a situation like you have with these dial-a-joke, those kind of things, where the program provider goes directly to the telephone company and leases time. So I think they'll work. The question more is who's going to get them. I think that also applies to shopping. I think that while I don't think the phenomenon is a fad, if it were possible ultimately to have a switch two-way interactive network where you could essentially pick from a catalog rather than waiting for every product to be shown every 10 minutes, it would be if it's economically feasible, it would be a more attractive product. I think pay-per-view will continue to grow, and that seems to be feeding on itself as well. Actually, the one you didn't ask about, I think, is the industry's most exciting new product is advertising. Mm-hmm. I think that There, not only does the diversion of audiences to cable networks appear to be accelerating, especially after the people meter test, but cable rates are still at discounts on cost per thousand bases. And I think that as product scanners and other kinds of research enable advertisers to pinpoint a lot better who's buying what product and what programs do they watch, that the efficiencies of that will be very beneficial for specialized media like cable networks. Assuming the industry can continue to fund and therefore own cable programming as well, you know, it could sort of like be a double-barreled hit. But I think of the new services, to me, advertising potential is the most attractive.
Some risk, but some upside for the industry.
Yes.
In short. Questions from our election? Yes.
You said that you thought it might not be a bad idea for the cable industry to lose a few. Would syndicated exclusivity be a good one to lose? How damaging would that be for the cable industry to lose that one?
The main effect, I think, of syndicated exclusivity and the copyright, which sort of go hand in hand, would really be on the superstations. I would say that, I mean, if you could pick and choose among the issues, that would be, for the average operator, those would probably be among the most harmless. If the industry could find a way to lose must carry, that'd probably be the best one. The one about ownership limits I don't think is that onerous anyway. I think essentially it only affects TCI, and although we're recommending the stock of TCI, since it's selling at half of what it's worth, and they would be forced to sell systems at full value and maybe get a tax certificate on balance, I don't think it's bad for them either. So if one had the luxury of choosing, that's where I would go.
Other questions? Well, Dennis, seeing none, I want to thank you for joining us on this cold January day, although it's a lovely day out. My colleagues want to present you with a memento of your occasion, Maroon on Georgetown. It's a lovely photographic compendium of the beautiful houses and some of the historical areas of Georgetown here in Washington.
Thank you very much. Okay.
That's our January program. You'll be receiving information with respect to our February program in the next couple of weeks. Thank you so much for coming.